Bonsoir à toutes et tous et bienvenue à notre session at a crossroads examining Canada-China relations for 2022 and beyond. I hope everyone has had a pleasant week and is enjoying the wonderful winter wonderland that we have outside. Je m'appelle Hadi Wess et je suis le rédacteur en chef de iAffairs Canada. So my name is Hadi Wess and I'm the managing director at iAffairs Canada. I am also a master's candidate at NPSIA and a TV host and radio host on Rogers TV and 97.9 FM. I am very pleased to be your moderator for this panel. Before we dive into today's conversation on the future of Canada-China relations, I wanted to acknowledge that while we may be having this event virtually, Canada University is located in Ottawa, and the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. We are very pleased to be joined today by an array of participants from across the world, including government officials, diplomats, politicians, policymakers, trade commissioners, professors, scholars, academics, and many more. Today's panel discussion will explore Canada and China's evolving relationship. A variety of themes will be covered, including trade relations, military and security concerns, and Canada's emerging Indo-Pacific strategy. Our speakers will examine Canada's foreign policy position with respect to China and how it can approach the bilateral relationship in the future. As you know, today's event is also presented by iAffairs Canada, the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, the NPSIA Students Association, and is supported by the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Of course, there are several individuals who are absolutely crucial to today's event, our wonderful panelists. For the sake of time, I will give a brief introduction to our spectacular guests, but I do encourage all of you to read more about our panelists and their work during and after the event. First up, we have Dr. Wenran Jiang. Dr. Jiang is president of the Canada-China Energy and Environment Forum and the advisory board member of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Second, we have Margaret Cornish, who is on the advisory board as a member of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and a senior advisor and Beijing chief representative for Bennett Jones LLP. Third, we have Dr. Jeremy Paltiel, who is a professor of political science at Carleton University and head of the Carleton Belt and Road Initiative Public Affairs Research Center. And finally, we have Peggy Mason, who is the president of the Rideau Institute on International Affairs and a former Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the United Nations. If I had to go through their biographies, we would need double the time for this event. So I'll just be enough with the titles that I mentioned, and I encourage you all to go and check them out. Just a brief reminder that all opinions discussed today are reflective of the individual person expressing them and do not reflect the views of the moderator, the organizers, iAffairs Canada, or the university. To go quickly over the event structure for tonight, the time is currently 6:06 p.m. We will be asking four major overarching questions with two panelists directly responding at any given time, and with two other panelists providing brief comments thereafter. We will rotate between main respondents and supplementary commentators. We will then break into an open question and answer session, Q&A, at around 7 p.m. for about 30 minutes. Based on the speakers and the number of questions, we might extend by 10 to 15 minutes, but participants can submit questions, especially in the question box. So you have a box that's called Q&A. So please make sure that you address your questions there, not in the chat box. If you would like your questions to be addressed by a particular panelist, please indicate as such. As you all have noticed, this event is being recorded and will be available a few days after the event. Please note that only the panelists and the moderator will be visible in the recording, and comments written in the chat and question boxes will not be visible in the final recording. Questions are private and confidential and will be narrated by the moderator without mentioning the name of the person asking the question, and they'll be answered by the panelists accordingly. So without further ado, I'd now like to delve into the substantive portion of our event, beginning with the first question. Our first question is on the rules-based order, with Margaret and Wenran as primary respondents. And this is the question. China's exercise of its growing political and economic power has prompted debate as to how it views its role in the world and what effect it will have on the rules-based order. 2021 also marked the 20th anniversary of China's accession to the WTO, ostensibly joining this rules-based order. Is China an enemy or upholder of the rules-based order? Have China's trade practices during the pandemic, including with Canada, represented compliance with its WTO commitments? Margaret, over to you.
So how does China view its role as the rules-based order? That's a key question. China sees itself as an active and constructive player of the existing order. For instance, in the United Nations, on the Security Council, peacemaking, it's one of the biggest contributors, development and other specialized United Nations agencies. It's a role well recognized by developing states, if not Western ones. It's developed parallel institutions that fill in gaps, but do not compete or challenge the established institutions. And it doesn't see itself as needing to obtain the permission of the US or the West to do so. Given its economic success and its history, it has the right to a seat at future global rulemaking tables. It is the US that's contesting China's rise in Asia that's led to the confrontation. It's certainly not an enemy. That's in uniquely US perception. China is already the largest trading partner of 120 countries, represents a fifth of mankind, the largest global economy by the end of the decade, etc. The only argument to support China's exclusion or constraint is that it is predatory. So that's the argument that is presented. We're already in a world order interregnum or transition. The Western-led norms of the liberal democratic order no longer held to be universal. The new order has yet to be built. These transitions are generally characterized by great power competition. As the great powers slug it out, the interests of smaller powers are at constant risk. We need to look to our own interest. While taking an active role in global and regional institutions, China claims the perceived right of other great powers, i.e. the United States, to stand outside the rules when it believes its core interests have been violated, territorial integrity and non-interference in internal affairs, such as Taiwan and Xinjiang. There have been a lot of these in recent years. While challenged sharply in the West, respect for sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs are UN Charter precepts with strong appeal to non-Western audiences. At the same time, China offers major new sources of investment in infrastructure funds and expertise. So the voices that you hear from these audiences are not broadly heard in Western discourse about China, and if they are, they assume that China buys these voices. So it's difficult to know. This is a contested world. China is cast as a wanton breaker of WTO rules, but scholarly investigation does not support these claims, at least not in relative terms. Leading scholars note that creeping protectionism by US and many leading world traders has risen since 2008 global financial crisis and is more impactful than subsidies. With respect to China's WTO compliance, on the negative side, we have trade coercion, when China seeks to stop a state from violating what it perceives as core red lines of territorial integrity and non-interference. It uses its position as marginal buyer of most commodities to deprive that country of China's import market, usually on a specific product like canola, for instance, in the case of Canada. It usually buys product in other categories to make up for the decline in the specific product. Canada's exports to China in the years that we were affected by this went up. This is obviously not in compliance with the WTO obligation for non-discriminatory treatment. On subsidies, while the US considered these to be violations of state-dominated economies, EU members and others often resort to subsidies to support trade industrial policy. In light of US effort to deprive China of semiconductor imports, Japan and the US have both succumbed to massive subsidization of domestic production. China declines to give up its privileges of being a developing country under the rules of WTO, which brings privileges, despite its rapid growth. And this has led to significant frustration as WTO operates by consensus and it has no agreed threshold for marking a transition. China considers itself the defender of developing country interests, but could abandon the status for itself if it chose. Those are the negatives. On the positive side, China has implemented in a relatively timely manner all the negative WTO dispute panel decisions made against it. It supported efforts of other members to develop like ourselves, Canada, to develop a temporary mechanism for nominating judges to the dispute panel system until the United States can be brought back on side to appoint them, to participate in appointing them. During the period 2018 to 21, the pandemic era, China continued with a range of domestic economic reforms, liberalization of banking and finance, the use of the negative list with respect to market access for foreign corporate investors, greatly reduced bureaucracy facing foreign companies doing business in China, and all of these fulfilling key demands of Western governments with respect to China's trade and investment regime. China's accession to RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Southeast Asia, and the CPTPP involved in accepting constraints on its SOE and subsidy disciplines as would its future accession, should that occur, to the CPTPP, which has even more stringent ones. While implementation of market access and the reduction of red tape has liberalized, it has taken a great deal longer than it should. It has, in fact, taken place. China regards itself and speaks as if it's the defender of globalization and the resistor of protectionism, which is naturally a major support to the WTO. If we turn to the US, there are other countries that this applies to, but if we turn to the US, it has a long-standing pattern of ignoring dispute panel decisions that are against it on the grounds that Congress failed to make the required changes to US law, reflecting a long-standing US congressional resistance to submitting to foreign arbitration, a similar stand as they have on softwood lumber. Refusal to confirm the appointment of new judges, which I mentioned above, and their reason is that they believe the judges are trying to make trade law, not arbitrate it. The Trump administration has disavowed the WTO as a venue for international trade governance, and Biden stepped back from this, but he doesn't have the political capital to reverse the position on judges. So the WTO enforcement mechanism remains inoperative. I've mentioned that the US itself has resorted to subsidies, so that's not particularly new anymore. Biden's Buy American policies are highly protectionist and discriminatory. For example, the recent proposal to give tax rebates for the electric vehicles made in the United States, but excluding those produced in Canada. I guess the most important element of the real dent in Canadian agricultural exports to China, which have been subject to Chinese coercion, is going to result over time from the managed trade deal that the US wrung out of China in its phase 1 trade agreement, eliminating in return for eliminating the American tariffs, which were also WTO violations on Chinese imports to the United States. The key point here is that Canada and other allies like Australia are direct competitors of the United States in all the categories covered in the US-China deal. So what China is, it has exchanged, managed, or controlled trade, which is a definite, clear, major violation of non-discrimination under WTO rules. So in summary, it's hard to argue that China is less rule-abiding than the United States with respect to trade. China is the top trade partner of 120 countries in the world, has sort of virtually all the countries in the world, has a huge interest in the success and durability of the United States. The United States, of the WTO, I'm sorry, a huge interest in the success and durability of the WTO. The United States has much less interest in this global trade rule because it's now focusing on trade with more specific countries, not the full gamut of them. China has the most to gain by stable rules-based system, handling disputes and making rules, taking disputes out of a bilateral relationship. I think there's lots of blame to go around on the WTO, but China's not the trade bugbear it's been portrayed. The role here is for middle powers with major exposure to trade like ourselves, which are, we're 60% of our GDP is exposed to trade, whereas the United States is only 25%. So you see the very big differences in the importance of trade to different countries.
Thank you, Margaret. I'd like just to turn it over to Wenran just to see his perspective on this. Wenran, over to you.
Well, the question is very important because if Canada, as reported, is working on a China strategy, we'd better have a better understanding of whether China is a rule, binding superpower, or it is some kind of a violator, it is some kind of outlaw. I'm not going to repeat much of the ground that Margaret has covered excellently. I can see that she gave us a lot of empirical data analysis between the behaviors of the United States, China, and the WTO mechanism. Let me just only add a few broader points to complement what Margaret already has mentioned. First of all, we need to understand the current rule-based order, quote unquote, as Americans and the Western allies talked about, was established back at the end of the Second World War when China was not a major player at all. Even it was a victor country during the Second World War. China did not have a say, especially the People's Republic of China. As China become a superpower status now, historically speaking, it's actually expected and natural to challenge the current international order. That is actually the historical reality if we go back to global history. Now the question in comparative terms, in a historical sense, Graham Allison of Harvard University, who wrote the famous book about the Thucydides trap, whether US-China will go to war is inevitable or not. People pay attention to the bigger question and the inevitability of going to war, but forgetting to read all the chapters of his book. One of them devoted to comparing historically how the Americans behaved when historically, about 120 years ago, it was in China's position as the rising number two on its way to become number one. And Allison's conclusion is China today is far less aggressive, a lot more in peaceful right side than the US in history has ever done. That's the first point I want to mention. We should not leave this historical dimension comparison out. China is behaving historically a lot more benign as a rising power. Point number two, who actually is violating international law? Because the rule-based international order, many developing countries, including China, actually has argued it should be United Nations-based ruled order, not the Western US conceived international order. And based on UN Charter which is the only legitimate international rule-based order, then we can do a count of the past 50, 70 years who have done most damage, aggressions around the world, launching wars, causing millions of people to die in this global order. So the conclusion is actually quite obvious. That's my point number 2. Number 3, there's a normative dimension other than the empirical dimension of this. The normative dimension is the current international rule order being established by UN, dominated by the Western countries? Is it good for the world at this stage in the 21st century? Is it good for the rich countries? Even the Americans feel it's not good enough for itself. That's why Trump done so much damage from WTO to WHO to a bunch of other international agreements. And therefore, is there a need to make the current international order more just and serving better to all the majority of the global population? So I think in talking about China as a rising power, whether it's following the rules, we should be broadening our thinking and address these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenran. I'd like, so Peggy and Jeremy, I'd like to hear your additional thoughts on this. I'd appreciate if you could give your comments to a minute or 2 each. We'll start with Peggy.
Me or Peggy?
Sorry, I just was having trouble getting to my unmuting.
You got it.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to very briefly add, it complements what's already been said, an excerpt from China's October 2021 statement to the Legal Committee of the UN General Assembly. Quote, "There is only one international order, the international order underpinned by international law." Well, sorry, the previous statement. "A few countries avoid talking about international law and advocate a rules-based international order. There is only one international order, the international order underpinned by international law, and there is only one set of rules, the basic norms governing international relations underpinned by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter." And I have to say, it causes me great grief to hear Canada parroting this rules-based international order. Whose rules, when we used to be such a stalwart voice for international law? And I would add this one last point. All great powers pick and choose what aspects of international law they will follow, and not just great powers. For example, the EU and Australia on the UN Refugee Convention, and Canada on the Arms Trade Treaty. There's a long list of double standards. But to paraphrase David Frum, despite all the imperfections, hypocrisies, and backsliding that have been a feature of state support for international law from day one, the question has always been, is the project moving forward? And in my view, it most assuredly is. So all of which to say, this is a straw man that the United States has built up as part of its, anti-China rhetoric, and we should have none of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Jeremy, over to you.
Yes, well, I guess I have a couple of short comments here. First, the rules-based order is sometimes used as a synonym for the liberal order. The liberal order is sometimes used as a synonym for the rules-based order. Now, China is not a liberal state. It doesn't claim to be a liberal state. And it actually denies the universality of liberal values. That's a fact. Okay? But we're talking about international law and the rules-based order centered on the UN. And in fact, arguably, China is one of the most stalwart supporters of the UN system of any of the great powers of the world. Maybe not more than the EU, but maybe not more than Japan, but at least, but in certain areas, much more. It is the largest contributor of peacekeeping forces, troops among the permanent members of the United Nations, and it is the second largest committer of funds to the UN peacekeeping forces. Okay, so yes, so here's an important fact. But China is not a liberal state, and there are legitimate complaints about China's human rights record. But here again, the question is international law, and to what extent these breaches of norms that we consider important ones are breaches of international law, and whether China goes through the institutional path to deal with them. That's a different question altogether. It's not to say that China hasn't ever violated any international law. As Peggy said, all great powers tend to. I mean, a paradox of international relations is that order in the international system is maintained by the great powers, but the great powers are always see themselves as exceptions to it when they feel like. That's the world we live in. And China is no exception. With respect to human rights, and I think we will say a few more words there. I mean, I think that China doesn't adopt our own individual-based human rights rule. But let's look at something that have to do with humane values or values. In the United States during the current COVID pandemic, 870,000 people have died. More than 870,000. In China, less than 6,000. And China has a population 4 times larger than the US. The death rate in the United States from COVID is 600 times larger than the death rate in China. That means that more than 850,000 Americans would be alive today if they had controlled COVID the way China had. Think about that. One would think that the most basic common denominator of human rights is human life. And here we have a question of human life. And China has raised more people out of poverty in the shortest period of time than any other country in history. So I do not deny China's violations of human rights. And I do not deny that crimes against humanity have been, at least in my view, committed in some cases in Xinjiang. But on other aspects of humane values, China has done better than the norm. And so when we demonize China, we should put it in some kind of context. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think we're off to a very good start, and it seems like our audience members agree. I'll just remind the audience members again, if you have a question, please make sure that you write it down in the Q&A tab, not the chat tab, because the chat tab is only meant for comments or questions relevant to the logistics of the event. So just another reminder. I'll move on to our second question. The second question is on the topic of trade, the diversification and bilateral relations. I'd like Jeremy and Wenran to be our primary respondents, and then Margaret and Peggy to be our secondary. So in December 2021, Prime Minister Trudeau stated that China is engaging in coercive diplomacy, which prompted the Chinese Foreign Ministry to respond, stating that Canada and China's bilateral relations are at a crossroads. A recent Angus Reid Institute survey from earlier this month notes that 3 in 5 Canadians prefer Canada trade less with China. What are some common misconceptions about trade with China in your opinion? And what will this diversification strategy mean for China's economy? More broadly, could you please outline the current key interests of Canada and its bilateral relationship with China? Jeremy, over to you.
Okay, so again, I'm going to go back to human rights, and I'm going to go back to the treatment of the 2 Michaels, first of all. Canadians are understandably angry about the treatment that the 2 Michaels received. And as coming from our own liberal background, we see the treatment of individuals as a microcosm of the treatment of everyone. So that when Canadians read about the treatment of the 2 Michaels, they see that is the nature, as far as they're concerned, that reveals the nature of the Chinese state. I tried to soften that image a little bit earlier. I'm not going to go much further in that, but I understand why Canadians are angry. But let's go back to some facts again. In 2020, China was the only major market in which Canadian exports increased, the only one. And they increased substantially. Second, in 2021, they increased again. Despite the poor performance of our economy in 2020 and 2021, our exports to China increased. Okay? Now, as for those like Mr. Farben, who said on the CBC that trade with China doesn't matter. Now, he was maybe an expert in security, but he's not an expert, but he's no economist. It's true that Canada's trade with China is only about less than 9% of our trade, much more to the United States. But it ramifies throughout their economy. And here I will also go back and what the price is when Donald Trump put tariffs on American imports from China. Americans paid more. The economists have done the research. Americans end up paying higher prices, and US investment declined as a result. Did not increase, it declined. As Margaret already pointed out, China is the #1 trading partner of over 100 countries, more than the United States. And it is important in practically every value chain. If you try to diversify your trade from China, if we would like to, the question is, China is the world's second largest economy. Where are you going to find the market the size of China? 2, we don't, our room for exporting to the United States, we already export 80% there. So we're going to cut out the world's second largest economy. All right, what is that going to do for your economy? Secondly, it's practically impossible for us to do that because everything that we would produce to export elsewhere also includes inputs from China. So this is an impossibility theorem. You know, for example, our policy now is to negotiate a free trade agreement with Indonesia. Indonesia has China as its #1 trading partner. Its economy is highly integrated with that of China, and it's a member of the RCE, the Regional Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. Indonesia is not going to divert its trade from China to divert it to Canada, and we will not be able to find too many more exports to go to Indonesia without. Okay, so let's not deal in fantasies. Okay, and if we want to stop trade with China, we will pay a price. Our standard of living will drop, investment will drop, our economy will suffer long-term damage, and we will become a less important trading partner. And it means actually, just say it clearly, we will pay higher prices and be poorer.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'll just move on to Wenran because I'd like to hear his perspective on this as well, and then we'll jump into Margaret and Peggy for comments.
Well said by Jeremy. So again, I only add a few points to complement his analysis. First, we have to understand that the Chinese have learned through his painful trade war experience in responding to Trump, US-China trade war. There are no winners in the trade wars. So therefore, contrary to the generally presented perception that China somehow is launching a trade war against Australia, against Canada, the numbers show just the contrary. Not only the trade volumes gone up between Canada and China in the past number of years, when we were in the lowest political relations point, Australia-China trade went up. And so Chinese tend to use rhetoric. Of course, Latvia, for example, On Taiwan, the Chinese are in some ways punishing them because it's too small a state. Australia, Canada is too important for China to use that logic. And therefore, China is smarter than we think they are in terms of how to use leverages. That's number one. Number two, when Prime Minister Trudeau is talking about China's coercive measures, I'm not sure he knows what he's talking about. Canada-China has no fundamental conflicts of interests. In fact, the two countries are highly complementary when it comes to economy and trade. Back in 2018, if we had not, under the US abuse of the bilateral extradition treaty, arrested Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, China would not have arrested the two Michaels as a retaliation. Nobody likes how the two Michaels are being treated, but we are the ones who knowingly, later on, that US politicized the case of Meng and still not releasing her because our law, extradition treaty, in fact, requires the Minister of Justice to release Meng Wanzhou when the case was politicized. Not releasing her was a form of intervention, as former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley said. We went along with that abuse, and therefore the Chinese done their part. But now the 3Ms issue, as resolved, we need to restore the relationship rather than fantasizing ourselves, as Jeremy pointed out, trying to waste $3.5 billion of money to diversify our economy to somewhere else other than China. China cannot be replaced as our second trading partner. And China, by the way, other than the trade numbers, is Japan, Britain, France, Germany, add more or less Italy combined. That's the China's economic and trade volume. And all of them adding up, matching maybe our trade volume with China. So where do we diversify? We should diversify using that $3.5 billion away from the United States. That leads to my next point. That is, US and Canada, when it comes to trade and economy, do not have identical national interests. In many sectors, we compete, especially in the energy area and the minerals and agriculture. The first phase one US-China trade agreement was a total disregard of the Canadian interests in the USMCA, just as USMCA itself, under Freeland, our negotiator, then foreign minister, sold out our sovereignty to let Americans decide whether Canada can negotiate a free trade with China. In 2 or 3 years' time, two major projects. I'm sitting here in Alberta. I'm telling our colleagues here, in 2 to 3 years' time, Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion will be completed. LNG Canada, the largest private investment, $40 billion project, now 50% completed, I just saw the report today, would be done by 2025. Both projects aimed at China as the major market, especially our LNG. 1 year, 13 million tons export to China, used by China, will reduce the entire carbon footprint of the British Columbia in 1 year alone. Justin Trudeau himself, when he was announcing the LNG Canada project, and in that sense, Americans are saying, we want to sign more LNG contract, and they have done many with the Chinese. And therefore, we need to diversify. If we keep our relationship as it is now, rather than improving, neither Trans Mountain spare capacities nor LNG Canada, when it comes to operation, would have a market in China. If we don't have a market in China, we have no market at all. Basically, that's the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenran. We're running a bit out of time in terms of the schedule, so I'll just ask the speakers if you could keep your comments shorter. Complimentary speakers or commentators, 30 seconds each. We'll start with Margaret and then Peggy.
I couldn't agree more with what's been said so far. I don't really have anything major to add.
Well, that was shorter than 30 seconds. Thank you. Peggy, over to you.
Same here.
Okay, perfect. Well, I mean, I didn't mean not to answer at all, but okay, we'll move on to the third question. Our third question will be about security and military relations and is addressed to Peggy and Jeremy as primary respondents, and then Wenran and Margaret as secondary. So recent Chinese military developments, such as the alleged building of new ICBM silos, have called into question the long-held assumption that China maintains a minimum nuclear deterrent only. In particular, US Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley called China's test of the hypersonic missile in October a Sputnik moment. Do you agree with these assessments? And if so, what should Canada's response be? Peggy, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is strong evidence that China is building 3 new intercontinental ballistic missile silo sites. So that would be the housing of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. Although how many will eventually be armed is unknown. So there's quite strong evidence of the building of these 3 new sites, but certainly questions remain as to exactly, how many warheads will result. A worst case scenario would be, and this is not going to happen tomorrow, it's over several years, would be 850 warheads would be the total Chinese warheads. That compares to their stockpile of approximately 300 now. So that's a really significant buildup by China. However, keep in mind, and this is rarely figures in public discussions of this, is that if China goes to this full length, that will its arsenal, its nuclear arsenal, will still be dwarfed by the American and Russian nuclear arsenals, with each of those countries maintaining approximately 4,000 nuclear warheads. So it is if China goes through with this, it's a significant buildup, but we have to keep in context the American and Russian arsenals in particular. And it's very important for us to consider, and I'll just touch on a couple of them briefly, the reasons for this buildup. And I think there's very strong evidence that the massive American $2 trillion plus nuclear weapons modernization program, on top of a nuclear arsenal that already significantly exceeds the scope of the Chinese capability, and in an environment, in a hostile environment, has raised doubts in the minds of Chinese defense planners over the survivability of their minimum nuclear deterrent, over the survivability of their retaliatory capability. Because remember, the basis, the essence of China's minimum nuclear deterrence, its stated policy and its force posture to date is maintaining sufficient retaliatory capability to deliver a devastating blow in response to a first strike. China, of course, has, among the 5, the only one, a no first use of nuclear weapons. Their stated purpose of their nuclear weapons are only in response. But minimum nuclear deterrence calls for the capability to deliver a devastating blow in response to a first strike, devastating blow, referred to otherwise as mutual assured destruction. And this, of course, is the basis for the deterrence in the first place. So China clearly fears, with some reason, that its current silos, its current land-based, its current silos for its land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles are too vulnerable to US cruise missiles. And this has led, it is believed, and I think this is quite credible, to them wanting to build more land-based silos in different locations, and also to build more mobile launchers. intercontinental ballistic missile launchers. And in fact, the CIA itself has made that point. They have specifically stated that they believe that China's deployment of its current road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile force was impelled by the US Navy's deployment of Trident, of a certain category of Trident missiles in the Pacific. But an overarching Chinese, and I might add longstanding Russian concern, is that potential improvements in American strategic ballistic missile defenses, and I emphasize potential because they're, you know, in reality, the American strategic ballistic missile defense system is in a word, a boondoggle, but nonetheless, both Russia and China have to hedge their bets against it working. And so there is clearly an overarching concern that potential improvements in American strategic ballistic missile defenses could also undermine China's retaliatory deterrence capability, thus calling for enhanced Chinese capacity. So, and bear in mind that it was to avoid an offensive arms race that the USA and the Soviet Union agreed to ban strategic missile defenses in the ABM treaty, the treaty that George Bush Jr. walked away from in 2002, and that problem has remained with us to this day. So my point here is that there is very strong evidence of an action-reaction arms racing dynamic. And it is absolutely essential that this Chinese buildup not further increase nuclear competition and worst case scenarios. But that is exactly what is likely to happen unless arms control and nuclear risk reduction is given a much greater priority, higher priority. And it seems clear that Biden wants to do that, but whether or not, you know, he faces very entrenched vested interests in the US. And so Canada really has a role to play here. I just want to say a couple of words because it was in the question about hypersonic missiles. You know, the Chinese position is that these will be conventionally armed, but there's an arms race here as well, with China actually currently leading the US by I think the estimate is around 3 years. Now, the reason why hypersonic missiles are so attractive, and I emphasize this is conventional, not nuclear, is their high speed and their maneuverability. Well, I mean, they can be either, but China has said they would be conventionally armed. Their high speed and maneuverability, these hypersonic missiles, is such that they're a challenge for air defenses. And they're also considered to be superior conventional warfighting systems. But this brings us back to the problem of American strategic ballistic missile defenses. And it is believed that the original impetus behind the Chinese development of hypersonic weapons was to be able to penetrate American missile defenses, bringing us back to this problem of the US abandonment of the ABM treaty and the resulting spur to the development of offensive systems to overcome BMD. So what should Canada be doing here? Well, I'll talk in more detail about this later, but there's a huge arms control dimension here for Canada. We used to be leading. We used to be a leading player multilaterally in working on arms control and disarmament and on risk reduction. And just to give sort of one sad example of where we are today, there's a very high profile initiative, which is called the Stockholm Ministerial Initiative. And it's in the context of the lead up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. It was supposed to be in 2020. It's been delayed twice. It's a very, very important conference with respect to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And the Swedes have been leading an initiative to try and to pave the way for an agreement at the conference, which the nuclear weapon states could sign on to, putting more meat on the bones of reducing nuclear risks and living up to their many commitments to reduce their nuclear weapons instead of going in the other direction. Canada's associated ourselves with this, but notwithstanding that it's a ministerial initiative, we've never even virtually at the ministerial level. It's always been at a lower level, parliamentary secretary or a resident ambassador. And so much more that Canada should be doing here. And one very specific area where Canada is, however, making a contribution, continuing to, despite incredible pressure to do otherwise, and that is Canada, in the context of NORAD modernization, has resisted, has continued to stay out of participating in American strategic ballistic missile defense. We've stayed out since 1985. And what we should be doing, we should continue to stay out. But the concrete area that we should be working on to help President Biden in is that it's very, very clear that strategic ballistic missile defense has got to be put on the table as part of further arms control negotiation with Russia and ultimately China. And there's every indication that Biden wants to do this, but he faces very, very strong domestic vested interests against it. So that's an area where Canada too can help. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Once again, we have a couple dozen questions to get through and we're just a bit behind. I'll ask the speakers to keep their comments short and then use all the knowledge, the extensive knowledge you have for the audience questions. Jeremy, 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, I'll be short. I'm going to shift the focus a little bit and say, look, China is aiming to be a military power second to none by mid-century, maybe possibly as early as the 2030s. That is a stated Chinese goal. And we are now approaching a period where China is reaching strategic parity in multi-dimensions with the United States. Well, what does that mean? And what does it mean for us as Canadians? First of all, the question is, we should not assume, I don't think Canadians should assume that full spectrum superiority of the United States is the only way to peace. On the other hand, one of the things we're talking about heightened deterrence and talk of a new Cold War. The Cold War stayed cold, but that was a fluke of history. We have no guarantee that a new Cold War would stay cold. And China fought the United States and the United Nations at that time to a standstill in Korea with rifles and men. China today is not just rifles and men. So the point I want to make here is that there is no guarantee that a military confrontation with China will remain limited in time and space and will not lead to, and there's no possible guarantee. In fact, I would argue that a military confrontation between China and the United States of any sort is likely to lead to a full-scale, unlimited war with the planet's destruction as a result. That means we need more diplomacy, and we have to redefine our notions of deterrence so that diplomacy is part of it, not the idea that somehow that we can have an arms race and that an arms race with China and that will secure us for the future. An arms race with China and a new Cold War may end up in exactly where we do. At the very least, by the way, a confrontation over Taiwan would lead almost immediately to the complete collapse of world trade. Even before the military engagement begins. We need to think more carefully about how we're going to handle our relationship with China. And the question is not how do we punish China, but how do we live with China?
Thank you, Jeremy. 30 seconds for each, Margaret and Wenran. I'll start with Margaret and then Wenran. 30 seconds, please.
I was simply going to say that AUKUS, interesting focus on nuclear propelled, very heavy submarines. Their whole focus would be to assist the Americans in a hunt and kill operation of Chinese submarines against the coast of China, which undermined China's confidence in its second strike capabilities. So Canada should be very glad not to have been included in AUKUS.
Perfect. Thank you, Margaret. Wenran?
There are forces in this country that want to nothing but Canada subordinating to US agenda against China. Not only that, they want to subordinate to the most extreme Trump right forces, disregard Canada's own independent national interest. I just want our colleagues online, participants, especially policymakers, listen to what Ambassador Peggy Mason, our former disarmament ambassador to UN just said, as well as what Jeremy put on the table for the terrible future, which could be a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenran. We'll jump into our fourth question, and then we'll start taking the questions of the audience. This question is addressed primarily to Margaret and Peggy, and then we'll have Wenran and Jeremy as secondary commentators. And this question will be about Indo-Pacific strategy and navigating Canada's path in the world. As the United States pursues a containment strategy towards China, what should China's own response be, in your opinion? Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly notes that the Indo-Pacific strategy will be released in the coming weeks and months. To what extent should Canada chart its own path as a middle power and play an intermediary role, as opposed to following in the lead of the United States? Should Canada align itself more with the European Union in terms of China policy? What are the possible implications of each? Margaret, over to you.
Thank you.
If you could keep it to 2 minutes, I would really appreciate it so we can get to the other questions.
It might be difficult, but the first point I would make is that other countries in the Asia-Pacific region are deeply ambivalent to US moves here. Canada needs to see the big picture rather than the American framing of the picture. Other countries have issues with China, but they've warned the United States they don't want to take sides. The fact that we are now calling it an Indo-Pacific strategy, as per Madame Joly, indicates just how much pressure we've had from the United States, who want the whole thing framed as a containment strategy. We've been hoping to retain the more constructive Asia-Pacific strategy, because what our interest is in fleshing out opportunities for trade and investment regionally. And we have, in order to take advantage of, we need to become a fully engaged partner in the region, which we aren't at the moment. Asia Pacific was going to see us as the cat's paw of the American position if we don't have much more independently framed understanding of the issues in the region and the ability to consult very closely with countries in that region. Our first interest is to avoid unnecessary confrontation with China, which is what the United States is trying to push us to. We want only to confront China on issues that are critical to our own interest. Secondly, we want to work with other powers to develop common understandings. I'm a realist. The Biden administration published today an Indo-Pacific economic framework, massive coordination within the American governments involved, and they're looking to involve all their allies. It will consist of 6 modules, each with economic modules, each with specific obligations and binding provisions. So this is to net us all into this program of containment. I'm a realist. We don't have much scope for avoiding participation in some form, but it's vital to develop clear understandings of our own interest and pursue them doggedly. We need to avoid, to the extent possible, the commitments designed only to antagonize and isolate China. If commentators see that this whole effort of the United States is to slow down China's rise rather than reverse it, that's a clear red flag for us. Given this situation, where do our interests lie? Canada is a minor power for both the United States and China. It's quite easy to understand why China, but let's just think about the United States. The US provides security. They see it as a one-way power relationship. We weren't mentioned in the countries that they weren't mentioned by the United States in this recent announcement as a country, as an ally to be consulted with respect to Asia. And I think we should understand, We've seen this across the board. The US tax credits on US manufactured electric vehicles, disadvantaging those in Canada. The vassal state language in the USMCA, preventing us from an agreement with China. Imposition of the aluminum and steel tariffs, no help on Madam Meng. Pipeline treaty violations in Michigan, turning down Keystone. Unwillingness to accept software lumber, dispute panel resolutions. I don't think there's a counterexample that comes to my mind. In some ways, this should liberate us to keep a low profile and not go along, other than in a very superficial way, seeking our own interests to the extent possible below the radar screen of both great powers. One thing we should be focused on is consulting not with the EU, but firstly with Asian powers to understand the regional reactions and possible alternative responses to the United States. These are the players with the most at stake and the most knowledge of what possibilities are for US success. The EU focus is partly because the EU focus in the question is partly because we don't have very well developed consultative networks in Asia. So this needs to be remedied first. Consulting with the European Union, of course, is a must, but we have to be informed by responses in Asia to the US initiative. I'll leave it there. I have a lot more to say, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Margaret. Let's move on to Peggy. Peggy, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. I want to focus on the sort of military side of the containment strategy and say right off the top that a military containment strategy is not the answer for Canada or for the US or its allies, least of all Canada. And the real answer is a much less confrontational military stance and much more diplomatic engagement. President Biden, and it's clear he knows this, needs deep cooperation with China on global existential challenges of climate change and of reducing nuclear risks. And he cannot do this while simultaneously treating China as an enemy. Aggressive, provocative, confrontational, in your face, forward deployed military strategy, which is unduly escalatory and which can have the gravest consequences when we are talking about two nuclear armed adversaries. I mean, all those adjectives are what constitute our fair description of America's containment strategy. And we looked at this in a recent Rideau Institute blog, because in the context of the ongoing, right now, Biden's nearing the end, the President Biden, of the administration's nuclear posture review, which is looking at the role, updating the role of nuclear weapons in American military strategy. And we looked in particular at the issue of American war gaming on how to avoid escalation. So, you know, the practice of militaries of where they try and, you know, they have the good guys and the bad guys, and they play out all these scenarios to try and learn how to avoid escalation. So this was a question that was put to a general in US Strategic, that is Nuclear Command, recently. And that was, what have they learned from all the war gaming they've done on how to avoid escalation in circumstances of aggressive conventional use of force by a nuclear armed state? And this really harkens back to Jeremy's comment about none of the conflicts between nuclear armed states not staying, conventional conflicts not staying conventional. So I will quote what he said. He said, "Our war gaming ends the same way every time. It ends with global nuclear war." If this is not a potent reason for avoiding provocative escalatory military strategies between nuclear armed adversaries, then I don't know what is. And you know, Canada doesn't have a huge amount of room to maneuver, but we have some room. And I've mentioned the role we can play in arms control. I've mentioned what we can do with respect to a stable, responsible approach to NORAD modernization. But also within NATO, NATO operates by consensus, and we should be working hard to keep NATO from endorsing the American Cold War Redux military strategy. So far, NATO has been skirting the edges, identifying the challenge from China in its communiques, but stopping short of calling it a threat. And the same is true of G7 statements. And we should be working hard to keep it that way, and actually to roll back the language. So there is a need to de-escalate and manage the US-China military competition, not be a gung-ho supporter of it. And there's lots of other things, but hopefully we can get into some of that. Well, maybe I might just make a quick point about Five Eyes, because this again is the Five Eyes intelligence network that Canada is part of, because this is also an example, a creeping example of where we're sliding into support for the containment strategy. What we need to do is emulate New Zealand, which has resisted the expansion at US behest of the Five Eyes intelligence network into the realm of foreign policy statements. I mean, unheard of, anathema to Canadian policy in the past, allowing intelligence network, which are supposed to inform foreign policy, to actually enter into the realm of foreign policy by making statements denouncing Chinese human rights abuses or other actions of nation states. This mandate expansion short circuits the ability of individual Five Eyes members to work with other non-US like-minded in larger multilateral settings to develop common statements that better reflect the nuances of their respective national positions. In the Five Eyes context, the US can throw its weight around. Using Five Eyes for human rights messaging is also hugely counterproductive. This is a stupid idea for the United States as well, because it's extraordinarily provocative and probably the worst way to deliver a credible message of just complaint about human rights abuses. So that's a very bad example of Canada kind of slipping into this containment strategy. And let's join New Zealand and stop doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. 30 seconds each. We'll start with Wenran, then Jeremy, and then we'll move on to Q&A for the audience.
Absolutely agree with Margaret and Peggy. Just adding one point. We are at the crossroad at today's seminar. Theme indicates, and Canada needs to demonstrate we have some independent foreign policy backbones. If in recent memory, we can see that Prime Minister Zhang Guaiqian started the trade diversification efforts by forming Team Canada, by daring to say we're not to join the illegal Iraq war. Prime Minister Martin, when threatened by US unfair treatment on lumber issues, sought China's lumber and other markets. Even Stephen Harper, Prime Minister Harper, highly partisan against the liberals, coming in power in 2006. After 2 years cold shoulder on China, once President Obama announced the first delay of the Keystone XL pipeline approval process, he booked his flight to China right away, asking China to help Canada on energy investment. And during his tenure, China poured in the largest amount of foreign investment into Canada, which created jobs until today and sustaining it. It's good for Canada. It's not a threat to our national security. And yet in the current government, we have not demonstrated that kind of efforts, that kind of guts in front of the Biden administration, totally canceling Keystone XL, now treating us continuously, almost like Trump administration in many fronts. So we need to ask these questions before we just tie ourselves into the US most hawkish wing of the anti-China agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenran. Jeremy, 30 seconds, please, and then we'll jump into questions.
Okay. Indo-Pacific Strategy means containment of China. That's what the words mean. We shouldn't be doing it because we shouldn't be stepping on the accelerator while we dismantle our brakes. That's what I've been trying to tell you, and that's what it means.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeremy. Now we can jump into the questions from the audience. We have a lot of questions, so I will really specify a panelist to answer a question. You won't all get to answer all the questions, so that you all have equal chances. I'll just specify the panelists who will be answering the question randomly. If you can keep your answer to 1 minute, please, so that we can move on to as many questions as possible, okay? We'll start with Jeremy. The first question is from a member of the audience, which states, did the Liberals abandon the Parliamentary Standing Committee because they believe they have satisfied opposition's demands with their pivot, or because Conservatives are wary of losing access to China's markets given dependence of Western provinces on trade with China? And between brackets, this assumes the committee served little purpose other than antagonizing China.
Look, the committee was a response to calls largely initially from the Conservative Party, which wanted to take a more aggressive anti-China stance. The other members of the opposition jumped on it as a way of embarrassing the Liberal government at the time when it was weaker. That's what it was about at the time. Now we have the Liberal government itself has shifted its position to a much more harsher anti-China. It's hard to say what a parliamentary committee would accomplish that has not already been accomplished. Our relationship with China has been securitized. So the only thing that would happen by this committee would be another sounding board for anti-China's views. And I want to actually add one more point here, which has not been addressed here. Anti-China means anti-Chinese. There's a rising tide of scurrilous, un-Canadian attacks on people of Chinese origin in Canada. I think we need to stop this. And I think that we should, if we're trying to stand up for Canadian values, we shouldn't be abandoning them in adopting things which will lead down a path of racism and discrimination.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. We'll move on to the second question. I'll pick Peggy for this question. It's from a member of the audience, and it states, I understand that Canada will always be closely tied to the USA. However, Canada is a very small country, except by land, and has little influence in the world stage. Why doesn't Canada's foreign affairs policy focus on practical and economic benefits other than ideology?
Thank you very much for the question. Well, I, of course, would argue that, I mean, I dislike, you know, declaratory policy myself. And, you know, one of the things I believe very strongly is that countries that want to lead in promoting human rights ought to make sure that and promote human rights and international law, that we're doing everything possible at home to ensure that we are acting in accordance with international law. And that's why I used that example early in one of my comments about the Arms Trade Treaty and Canada having been named and shamed by the UN expert group on Yemen. I mean, never would I believe that we would be named and shamed twice in 2 reports for contributing, for exacerbating the conflict in Yemen because of our arms exports to Saudi Arabia in blatant violation of our commitment not to do that under the Arms Trade Treaty. The first criteria is not undermining international peace and security. So I think that it's actually very important. I support strongly promoting respect for international law, and I think the very best way to start doing that is to act in accordance with it yourself, and also to avoid double standards, so that when you're never calling out your friends and you're only calling out your non-friends for violations, that's not very helpful either. And the final point I would say here is that I also believe very strongly, and no one will be surprised by this, that Canada getting back to very practical steps to promote arms control and to promote nuclear risk reduction. I mean, that's practical and that's in our interest. And likewise, reducing tensions with China. We'll all feel the impact of a global nuclear war, but on the issue of climate change, I mean, we all have an interest in the United States and China cooperating on this issue. And so what we need is less declaratory policy from Canada and more getting back to the kinds of good ideas and creative diplomacy and sustained engagement that we have been known for in the multilateral arena in the past.
Thank you, Peggy. Wenran, the third question is yours. And if you could keep it to a minute, please, I would appreciate it. A question from the audience. What common ground can Canada find with China in international development partnerships? Could we realistically cooperate on projects in regions like Latin and Central America or Eastern Africa, for example?
We could cooperate with China on many, many fronts. Canada's late decision to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was actually a good decision for us, contrary to the conservatives who actually wanted to pull out a bank that's by international standards after how many years seen as running better in its loan practices than World Bank and IMF. And therefore, it's in our national interest to be a member of AIIB, for example, and to potentially join in some ways, and we're qualified by being a member of AIIB to work with China on the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, in Central Asia. We know today, back in 2009, China overtook the United States, becoming the largest trading partner to Africa. Today, China trades with Africa more than twice, maybe 3 times, the US. It's never looking back. The same thing is happening in Latin America. This was this old story being seen as a threat in Africa first. Now, in the backyard of Latin America, China will take over Latin America, quote unquote, in the trade side, because they're good for them, because there's no complaints by majority of African countries. So Canada can not only benefit from the bilateral dimension, but there's an international dimension that we're doing very good work. China needs us on high international standards, on bidding, on contracting, on the kind of things that we do well historically. We should not forget about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenran. Margaret, the question is yours. 1 minute, please. It's a question from the audience. Will today's news of China's $645 million possibility of imposing tariffs by the World Trade Organization on the US negatively affect diplomatic relations with North America? Should Beijing decide to make use of it? Or is this a far out possibility? You're on mute, Margaret.
Unmute yourself.
I don't get the beginning of the question.
Sure, I'll repeat it. It says, will today's news of China's $645 million possibility of imposing tariffs by the WTO on the US negatively affect diplomatic relations with North America should Beijing decide to make use of it? Or is this a far out possibility?
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with you say it happened today. It's not the I don't see how. I
can move on to another question if that's.
Yes.
Okay, so it says the sober, realistic, and pragmatic views expressed by the panelists are, it is probably safe to say, not in sync with the mainstream anti-China narratives put forward by a number of the prominent China commentatria in Canada, the US, and elsewhere in the West, as an example, Australia, and even in Japan. How can these more sensible approaches get heard in the corridors of power rather than get dismissed offhand as they are in the current climate?
The sensible ones being the ones that our own, or the ones that people disagree with us. There's incredibly strong views in Canada at the moment, which I would say it just partly the passage of time. I think you're going to, as a result of the Madam Meng to Michael's issue, I think I already sense that there's a more sensible attitude beginning amongst, especially among younger people. My own generation has very set views on the subject of China that aren't really changing. And that might, I think let's take it to the Coalition for Democracies. I think we're beginning to see that the Americans don't have much freedom of movement domestically, and that whole initiative is going to come a little unstuck, in that democracies is not the, democracies versus autocracies is too simplified a way of looking at China. So I think the whole world is moving towards a more nuanced view of China.
Thank you. We'll move on to Jeremy. Jeremy, a question from the audience. What is the level of China knowledge and capacity in the government of Canada and in the private sector? What should be done to improve them and fill any gaps?
Oh, this is a question I've been talking about for many, many, many years. I actually don't agree with some who said that the level of China knowledge within the government is that low. Actually, we have some people who know China quite well inside the government. And the question is whether they have the platform even inside the government to actually make the policy. Mm-hmm. There are many Canadians who are quite familiar with China. Our commentariat, our media are more ignorant and more anti-China. In the business community, there has been a problem for many years in terms of our opening, going over there. I've sat in on meetings where people talk about going to China, business people going over without knowing much about the country and then getting burned. I mean, Margaret could probably tell you more stories about that than I can. I mean, I think that there is no doubt that there was a lot of naivete about China over the period of 30 years. And that in some ways the negative reaction we're seeing today is a result of the fact that we didn't know very much in the first place, and we failed to learn very much during that period, and therefore we became disillusioned and jaundiced in our relationship with China. Now we're in a very different place, and I'm not sure, it's a question not so much of knowledge but framing. Because the problem is that our relationship with China is now being viewed purely, and this is what's happening, through the frame of security.
Right. And
that, in a sense, if you're looking for security problems, you will find them. There are some, then they're real. The question is that everything? And that's the problem that we have to face today. How do we put the security part of the issue, which is real, how do we put it into some kind of context and enable us to move forward on the areas that we have to live together with China, on climate change, on the danger of nuclear war, on pandemics, and also simply keeping the global economy alive. That's all I have to say on that issue.
Thank you, Jeremy. Next question is to Peggy. What is the best way to resolve tensions on the South China Sea, given that China has rejected the International Tribunal finding that its claim is illegal under UNCLOS, and the risks that extensive freedom of navigation patrols by the US Navy and others could spark a military clash or incident with the PLA?
Thank you. Yes, that's a very, very good question. Of course, Canada used to play quite a big role on the non-governmental, well, on the track 2 level or the track 1.5, some government officials, but a lot of academics working very hard on confidence building measures in the South China Sea, trying to head off where we are now. But that was some time ago that we were playing that very, very active role. I mean, you know, this is really a tough one because China, although the positive thing is that they haven't launched a direct attack on, largely they're very strongly supportive of the UN law of the sea, but they've argued these historical claims argument, basically saying, oh, well, this is a bad ruling. But I would say that, and this is a proposal that some have made that I do strongly agree with, that we should be encouraging Southeast Asian governments to get their ducks in a row completely with respect to their claims and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They should be doing everything they can to reduce, delimit, and regulate their overlapping claims, and getting everything in order with respect to their exclusive economic zones and continental shelf claims. That does put pressure. That does put pressure on China and furthers the rule of law. But whether practically speaking, I mean, it'll reduce tensions, but whether it's not going to change, China's position with respect to the claims that they're making, I don't think. And the question, the way it was put, kind of showed what the thinking was with respect to the American. Well, it was regional powers, but essentially United States leads on these shows of force through freedom of navigation operations. I mean, essentially, I would argue, many have argued, this is really an abuse of freedom of navigation to turn it into a show of a provocative show of military force in the way that the US is doing. So certainly I would prefer it if Canada did not, join in such actions. So very good question. This is a tough one, but in many ways, the countries in the region are showing the way, by trying very hard and where they can, taking their cases for arbitration. Something that Canada, we have reservations on a number of boundary disputes and don't allow arbitration on them. So we could learn something there too. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peggy. We're a minute away from 7:30, and I know that the panelists have agreed to go for about 10 to 15 minutes. Maybe we can accommodate for more questions. So I'll ask the panelists again to keep your answers to 30 seconds to a minute so that we can take as many questions as possible. Wenran, this question is for you. What are your thoughts on China's intelligence services providing financial or other support to Canadian academics and politicians?
Well, if you listen to the general narrative in the mainstream media, and those who conducted the so-called the China Initiative in the United States between the Justice Department and FBI, the Chinese government is an alien force that through different means, direct or indirect, monetary or intimidation, or through social media, controls all the foreign academics, students of study abroad, including probably the Chinese origin population around the world. This is really something few people come up to even dispute. Is this a real fact? I don't think so. China, like every great power, try to assert influence of some sort. But as proven now by the so-called China Initiative in the United States, it's a total new McCarthyism. They came up after years and years, case after cases, they come up with nothing, literally nothing. Now there's a general collective academic community call in the United States for the Biden administration to end this racist, anti-China, anti-immigrant, anti-international exchange practice. In Canada, what happens? We follow the narratives as if somehow a politician lost his seat in BC in the last election was a result of Chinese interference. Something happened on WeChat, somebody lost his seat. No proof, just the narratives, okay? We now have a new national security guideline for all the scientists who apply for national natural science and engineering fundings to self-identify national security risks. Thousands of Canadian academics of Chinese origin have called this out as a very dangerous practice. The intention may not be McCarthy's or racist. The result is self-censorship. Therefore, we need to think about where we go from there, what kind of society we are. And we need to assess our capacities and give credit to the Canadians of Chinese origin that they can actually make their own decisions. They're not some kind of a puppets of the Chinese government. I'll stop there. I can go on forever on this issue.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Margaret.
I just want to jump in with a tiny point, sorry, because I really think this is important when we're talking about intelligence agencies, because they're presented as some kind of sort of a totally objective organization, when in fact, with respect to the Canadian intelligence agencies in particular, they have a vested interest in maintaining their access to American intelligence. So they have a vested corporate interest in doing what the Americans want. And we really have to factor that in when we look at intelligence reports. And you know, I spent a long time doing peacekeeping training with NATO, stabilization training, and I was involved in the preparation of intelligence assessments at a high level, and they are often extremely problematic. And so we've really got to start having in this country an adult critique of the intelligence services. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. The next question is for Margaret. How can we separate the Canadian policy towards China away from the United States policies? And what makes us distinct from the US in relations with China?
We are not trying to challenge, we're not trying to support American primacy in Asia. It's not in our interest. So that is the fundamental difference of opinion, but difference in interest between Canada and the United States. Our interest is in peaceable relations with all countries in the Asia-Pacific region. So the principal difference is difference in interest. And in terms of pursuing it, I thought I tried to make clear that our pursuit of, as we've discussed before, very practical trade measures. Diversification of trade through Southeast Asia is a fine idea as long as we don't abandon, but only develop our economic relationship with China. Both have to go together. I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we'll have 4 or 5 more questions, and that's why if we keep it 10 minutes, we'll answer them all. Jeremy, the next question is for you particularly. What are your thoughts on the BRI? Is China's foreign investment as predatory as pundits say relative to Western investment?
The BRI is a grandiose project which has not panned out as much as both its initiators want or its critics decry. So there is no evidence that the BRI is intended to cause debt traps. But there are problems with some of the practices of the BRI. And the interesting thing is that Chinese investment in the BRI over the last 3 years has been declining, not increasing. There have been problems in many of the projects. The whole idea behind the somehow providing infrastructure thing without conditions has not worked out very well for China, because sometimes many of these projects turn out to be economically unviable because they're white elephants by particular political leaders, or if there's a change in government, they come back. And so there are problems throughout the BRI. As an idea, of course, it's an addition of there's a crying need for investment in infrastructure in Asia and Africa, but this needs to be implemented more carefully than it has been so far. And China's beginning to realize that, and has pulled back from many of these projects. Even the flagship of it, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, has not worked out very well in China's favor. And Pakistan is now calling for reducing its debt. It is both dependent and trying to reduce it. So there are many, many problems with the BRI. So the point is that some initiatives may look good from the outside, but the practicalities of them may sometimes make them more unmanageable. And I doubt the BRI will turn out to be probably on balance a positive impact on global development, but it will not be the threat that that some people have said, nor will it be the same kind of glorious project that Xi Jinping probably hoped it was to begin with. So it's a mixed bag, really.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll move on to Peggy for this question. The GOA sent a request to Alberta universities back in May 2021, singling out China research projects, implying a danger to Canada's security. My understanding, that the person who's asking, my understanding is Alberta universities have submitted data regarding research with China, but I have yet to see the GOA make a further statement. Do you know the result? Thank you.
No, I'm afraid I'm not aware of that specific situation with respect to Alberta.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
I'll jump in because I'm retired from University of Alberta. I can tell you back in 2007, when I was the founding director of the China Institute, the same Alberta government, the higher education, the same department, wrote us 2 checks of totally $37.2 million. The mandate they gave me, only one, build bridges with China. Today, we hear the same government, the same department wanted to give executive orders to burn all bridges to China. Last summer, they ordered all the 4 public Alberta universities to stop there's no conditions, suspend all interactions with Chinese education institutions, 90 days limit to submit existing projects, simply because the Globe and Mail reported something that somehow University of Alberta has a lot of research collaboration with China. This is an unprecedented government intervention in academic freedom. I was the founding director of the China Institute, participated and founded many of the projects at University of Alberta. I was Dr. Elizabeth Cannon's advisory board member on her Asian Council when she was president on University of Calgary. These universities have taken very serious responsibilities in evaluating every collaborative project with China, with security concerns on top, on every project, I can tell you. But I put these questions to 4 provosts and vice presidents on the forum from Harvard, from MIT, Stanford, and Princeton, and one other university, I think is U Pennsylvania. They were shocked to hear that a government in Alberta, in Canada's province, could order its public university to suspend. They said, we have not come in the United States with all the rhetorics to that kind of intervention. They were very alarmed. So we need to know, the public need to know, such interventions is actually has a choking impact on freedom of academic exchanges between universities.
Thank you, Wenran. 2 more questions, one for Margaret, one for Peggy, and then we can call it a night. I'll start with Margaret. Margaret, how do you think the current situation in Ukraine and tensions with Russia will impact the US-China competition and Canada's approach towards China?
Well, the interesting similarity is that we have diaspora from both countries. And that's a major impact on any country's policies. One thing that I see is that a little bit the Russians kind of outsmarted the Americans. They never intended to do anything with them. It was just a game, gaming the United States. And I see that with respect in Asia, with the Americans gaming the Chinese on Taiwan. So, but in terms of Canada's relationship, not really. Except with that parallel to Taiwan, not really.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the last question with Peggy. And the question is, what is the best path forward for Canada to take with regards to the Uyghur genocide, given the tense and escalatory climate between China and the Western powers like the US and Canada?
Very good question. Well, obviously, I think that the current approach, it is not helpful. I mean, I think, using these very serious, this very strong evidence of very serious abuses as, as support for this very confrontational, hostile approach. I think that's, I think we have forums on, and likewise, the Summit of the Democracies, which was actually even, ridiculed in the United States because the commentary was, Biden should be more focused on domestic problems with American democracy than, leading the charge across the world. But we have fora, we have fora in which these issues can be discussed. We can have very clear statements made about the concerns. They can be brought up in bilateral talks regularly and then referenced following those talks. I mean, there's a whole range of multilateral and bilateral tools, mechanisms and tools for registering concern about these issues. And I think that, that is the way to do it. I referred to the Five Eyes example. I mean, having an intelligence agency denounce Chinese human rights abuses really devalues our concern over human rights, because it's it's using it as a tool in another game altogether. So lower the rhetoric and try and demonstrate. And again, I come back to leading by example wherever we can. And that means, for example, in Canada's case, that means not being silent about Israeli abuses, grave breaches, which have been called out, in UN Security Council resolutions that have been called out in the UN General Assembly over and over again. Irrefutable evidence of grave breaches of international law by Israel in the Palestinian occupied territories, and Canada remains silent on that. So, we really have to end the double standards if we're going to be credible and have a very measured and consistent policy with respect to adherence to international human rights standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. And with the conclusion of our Q&A session, this brings us to the end of our event, At a Crossroads, Examining Canada-China Relations for 2022 and Beyond. Sincere thanks that I have to dedicate, so bear with me. I want to thank everyone who actually made this panel possible. It is great to see such an impressive turnout. Sincere appreciations to our speakers, Peggy, Wenran, Margaret, and Jeremy, for such an insightful, engaging, and thought-provoking discussion, which really reflects the level of knowledge and expertise each of you possesses in the field. We thank you for your active participation, and both before and during the event, and for that we are eternally grateful. Thanks to our partners for their continuous support, including the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, and the NPSIA Students Association. I would like to particularly thank the organizers who have put in a lot of effort behind the scene, including Jenna Richmond, Jillian Hawley, and Ashton Matthias, and of course, our Executive Director, Dr. David Carment. And last but not least, thanks to the audience members who joined us today, those who listened actively, asked questions, shared comments, offered something to reflect on, and learned something new. Your participation, engagement, passion, and interest are the backbone to our success and exposure, and we look forward to having you in future events. So we wish you a great evening, and stay in touch, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.